Thanks a lot, Manuel, for this introduction and for organizing such important moment of conversation. Welcome, everyone. Today, I will present a panel organized by the Night Governance Working Group at International Night Study Network. The main purpose of this panel is to investigate whether there is a common narrative in Australian nighttime economy. I would like to introduce the speakers of today's session. First of all, I would like to introduce you to Anna Edwards, who is a PhD researcher at Melbourne Centre for Cities, Architecture, Building and Planning. Her PhD project is about night labour market trends in Australian cities. Then I would like to welcome James Hulme, Director of External Affairs and Programs at the Office of 24-Hour Economy, New South Wales Government in Australia. And then welcome Naeem Abdi, Director of Productivity and Livability at the Greater Sydney Commission in Australia. Welcome, everyone. And thanks for being here with us. I would like to start this panel by asking you, how did you get into the research and practice on the nighttime economy, and what have you considered more interesting so far?
I can start off if you like. Thank you, Alessia. I suppose kind of just give you a little bit of background, I suppose, as to where I've kind of come from and where my interest stemmed from. So I grew up in a hotel in North Wales, and I spent my youth actually working for MySpace, which is, if anybody remembers MySpace, it was kind of pre-Facebook, but kind of touring events and festivals, kind of with the MySpace bus and having artists on board. And so I kind of developed this interest in kind of events and festivals, and my MSc dissertation was actually looking at the development of events and festivals in the UK. I then went on to work for an economic consultancy called TBR, and we actually developed the first measurement of the nighttime economy in the UK, which we calculated at the time to be about £66 billion. And then more recently, I have my own consultancy in Genium Research that kind of conducts research, the annual measurement of nighttime economy on behalf of Council of Capital City Lord Mayors, and we also do lots of work for kind of councils. And as you mentioned, I'm doing my PhD on the nighttime economy, so I suppose the nighttime economy is kind of all encompassing for me. I have a particular interest in kind of the measurement of the nighttime economy, so understanding kind of how many businesses operate, the number of people employed within or employed at night, and the amount of turnover it generates. I think at the moment is a particularly exciting time, because although traditionally we've kind of looked at things like the metrics I've just mentioned, but also kind of crime, number of live music venues and liquor licensing and that type of thing. More recently, kind of, and particularly as a result of COVID, we've been looking at kind of new and innovative data sets, such as looking at mobility, spend and opening hours. So I suppose that's kind of my particular interest, based on kind of a consultancy background. But I suppose more recently, and particularly with my PhD, I'm looking at the evolution of the nighttime economy within Australia and trying to understand kind of where we kind of have come from and how we have arrived at where we're at. And I'm really interested in kind of some of these kind of huge changes that have happened as a result of the pandemic. I can talk a little bit about kind of, I suppose, that background that I'm looking at, or I can give somebody else a chance to introduce themselves. I don't know.
Yep. Thanks, Anna.
I'm happy to kind of share my background. My background and interest in the nighttime economy has been largely because of my professional experience, where I had a long career in investment attraction for the New South Wales government and the Queensland government. But the reality is when you bring investors in, they still want to have a vibrant place to go and live in. So you can have all the correct, KPIs to make a place look, productive and so forth. But if you don't have a thriving, vibrant nighttime economy, you're not going to really be attracting the right investors, the high value investors, your international students, your international visitors. So that was really where I got quite fixated to see, how can we make a place vibrant? So I did a little bit of a career segue from being in the trade investment space, moving off to placemaking and working on doing precinct plans for various different precincts across Australia, from Liverpool in Western Sydney down also to Adelaide. And that gave me a veering off into the Greater Sydney Commission, where I worked on the COVID-19 report, city shaping impacts of COVID-19, and that really kind of highlighted how stark the impacts were on the nighttime economy and its associated sectors, hospitality, retail, the list just went on. And now, obviously, in my current role as Director of Productivity and Livability, there are multiple components of the work that I do that see the nighttime economy as being a key driver to revitalizing our various different sectors, our various different centers. I can go on where we think the nighttime economy is being really critical as part of our rebound back for our new 6 cities region. So that's my, in a nutshell, region. But also, I think personally, I actually like going to places and exploring it at nighttime. It's I recall, going on a work trip to Hong Kong and arriving there at, probably like 11 p.m. And I thought, let me go out and explore. And it's a vibrant, thriving city. And too often I think in our backgrounds we come from cities where it's just a 9 to 5, and from being a pure productivity kind of person, that isn't making productive use of our assets, of our investment, of our time. It's a way too linear way of looking at our lifestyles. So that's my background. Happy to share more about the work I'm doing at the Greater Cities Commission and our current projects, but also eager to engage with Anna and James. James also happens to be a former colleague of mine. But thank you, Alicia.
Thanks a lot, Naeem.
And good evening, everyone, and thanks for organising this. It's always great to have these kind of global dialogues, particularly around nighttime economy. In terms of my background, I sort of fell into some of these policy issues. I moved to Sydney 7.5 years ago from the UK, and I thought moving to Sydney, I was moving to somewhere that was sort of mixed between Miami, Barcelona, and Tel Aviv. As you may know, Sydney has many natural attributes, a very temperate climate, a very beautiful natural environment, a beautiful coastline, national parks, wine regions. But for some reason, its nighttime economy had really declined in recent years, partly due to overregulation and a regulatory environment that was prohibitive to a lot of nighttime activity, but partly as well because it just wasn't coordinated at a governance level, and particularly getting different bits of government to work under a nighttime economy strategy. So I've been researching and working on nighttime economy policy in Sydney for about 4 years, including I wrote a think tank report around how to enhance Sydney's nighttime economy, which then led to helping to co-write a government strategy. And about 12 months ago was asked to come into government to help implement that strategy. So I'm a bit of poacher turned gamekeeper. I'm trying to implement some of the ideas that myself and others developed. It's not without its challenges in terms of getting sometimes an unwieldy bureaucracy to do things a bit differently, but also we've obviously had COVID, a number of lockdowns over the last 2 years, which have had a really detrimental impact on the nighttime economy within Sydney and within Australia. We've also got a real reputational challenge now around what people term Fortress Australia. For the last 2 years, we've essentially told people not to come here and made it very, very difficult to leave the country and for people to visit for understandable reasons given the pandemic. but we now have to do a 360-degree U-turn and convince the world that we are open, particularly to tourists and to students and to talented people who want to come and live and work here. And a big part of that, to Naeem's point, is to demonstrate a vibrant cultural and nighttime economy. The one big thing we have going for us in Sydney, and particularly in Sydney, but also Australia generally, hugely diverse cities. Sydney has around 42% of its inhabitants were born overseas. That's a larger percentage than London or New York. We have incredible diversity, an incredible story around our First Nations people and the Indigenous heritage. We also, we're a port city, so we've had waves of immigration that have enriched the culture of our city. So we start from a good position, but we do have some real challenges over the next couple of years. So happy to talk about those.
Thanks a lot, James. It was really interesting to learn from you and to engage with different background and areas of expertise. And this is one of the main purpose of today's panel, just to bring different perspectives around the nighttime economy governance, how it has been regulated before and during COVID-19 pandemic in Australian cities. And as you already mentioned, and some of you already mentioned about COVID-19 pandemic impact on the nighttime economy, I would like to ask you if you can further elaborate on it based on your research and experience. What has been the impact of COVID-19 on the nighttime economy in Australian cities?
You know, I'm happy to go and start off because I think it's, you know, it was quite a unique privilege to actually do a report on COVID-19 while living through COVID-19. It was quite a stark experience. You know, we had regular consultations, and as part of it, we were almost having a therapy sessions with individuals that we were actually consulting with. It was such a live, real experience. I'm happy to kind of share a bit more of the industry impacts, but the one thing from a city shaping perspective that really stood out to me was the impact that the nighttime economy had across our spread of cities and centres across Greater Sydney. So James was talking about the advantages that Greater Sydney has. One of the other advantages that we do have is that we are quite a polycentric city. So we actually have 3 metropolitan centres, and we have a diverse spread of other centres across Greater Sydney. So while we did see a significant downturn in our 3 CBDs, we also saw a significant upturn in our local centres and in those local suburbs. And this is a real opportunity for the nighttime economy. While I think it is really an opportunity to still have a strategy that revitalizes our CBDs, because there's existing assets in there that need to be leveraged, particularly the beautiful images that both yourself and James have behind you all. But the big change has been the local suburbs at nighttime have become alive. And prior to COVID, they weren't as alive. I just last week went to Ramadan nights down in Lakemba, where there are 1 million people converge on one street in Lakemba over the period of Ramadan. There are so many other centres that have boomed once the initial lockdown was over, and people stayed closer to the home and much more local. So that's a challenge, and that's an opportunity. And from a person like me who's in a planning organisation, that's a city shaping opportunity that we need to kind of see how can we kind of grasp it. But I'm happy to engage in a bit more of a free-flowing conversation, because I think it really is an exciting topic of how do we kind of plan for our re-emergence out of COVID, particularly to capture things that have worked well, like, you know, local centres, and the things that haven't worked well, like our CBDs, how do we help them recover?
I will defer to Anna, because I think you're in the most locked down city in the world, so an interesting perspective.
Yes, yeah, yes. I spent a lot of days in lockdown, which also gave me a lot of time to research and understand, I think, what was going on at the time. I kind of published a report for CCLM looking at kind of the future of the nighttime economy, which was trying to kind of look and try and kind of guess or second guess kind of what was going to happen next at that kind of those critical times, kind of when we were still in lockdown and trying to figure out where we were going to go. I really, yeah, and I actually quite like it now, because I'm about 25k out of the Melbourne CBD, and I'm actually enjoying that there's new cafes and restaurants kind of popping up kind of close by to me as well, which is fantastic. But also there's been kind of, it seems like everything's kind of opening up in the city again, and there's been kind of lots of opportunities to head in, and it's, yeah, it seems kind of more alive. I think also kind of back in the people are heading back onto campus as well, and we've got international students back on campus, which is fantastic. And I know that they are particularly interested in kind of engaging and kind of getting together a lot. So just before this meeting, actually, I had somebody emailing saying, oh, can we organise a get together at King and Godfrey, which is our local favorite restaurant. So yes, I think everybody's kind of really excited about kind of everything opening up. I suppose as part of I can kind of let you know a little bit of kind of about the research that I've been doing. I suppose, and one of the things I was looking at is kind of looking historically to understand kind of where the nighttime economy came from, and then understand kind of where we're at now. And a lot of people will, I suppose, in this room will kind of know this already, but I'll mention it, just that I suppose the interest in nighttime economy stemmed from kind of Europe in kind of the 1970s, UK in 1980s, 90s. Comedia, which was a consultancy kind of back then run by Charles Landry, was particularly influential in kind of encouraging kind of the activation of cities at night, or town centres particularly. And it was kind of about the regeneration of town centres, with kind of people with lots of kind of retail moving out of town and that type of thing, and obviously kind of some of the shifts in the way that the economy was working at the time. So that was kind of back then, looking at regeneration. I suppose kind of in Australia, that kind of the kind of nighttime economy, or interest in the nighttime economy, I suppose kind of emerged kind of, well, some of the things that I can find is kind of Adelaide in like the late 90s, I was interested in nighttime economy. And then 2005, they started looking at the 24-hour economy city policy for Melbourne. I suppose I'm kind of going off topic from pandemic here, but I think it's just useful to know, I suppose, where we've come from in Australia, seeing as kind of it's very Australia centric that we're talking about. And then the interest very much was kind of in liquor licensing, as was kind of in the UK and kind of Europe, like liquor licensing and regulating that, and around kind of the fallout of kind of crime and safety. Just before the pandemic, there was kind of more interest, I suppose, kind of in that kind of diversity and the vibrancy that Naeem was talking about, and that was kind of already kind of underway. It was kind of people were kind of starting to take more interest in that. But I think as a result of all this, the impact of the pandemic and like the terrible impact that it had on kind of the people who work in that kind of those core kind of food, drink and entertainment sectors, then yeah, it's definitely kind of shifted. There's even more interest being generated than there was in the lead up to the pandemic. And I think there's kind of a huge lot of opportunity that has come out of that. As we look instead of kind of looking at regenerating town centres as it was in the 90s, we're now looking at reactivating city centres kind of over here, and that kind of potential shift from kind of, I suppose it will always be the central business district, but kind of more of a shift towards kind of central entertainment or experience district, as it's been kind of mentioned. So there's yeah, lots of really exciting opportunities. I think it's probably really important to mention kind of I think the worst impact was that kind of so many people lost their jobs. So in the early impact of the pandemic, the International Labour Organization estimated about 18 million people lost their jobs in food and accommodation services worldwide. And in Australia, it was around kind of 20% of people lost their jobs. But within kind of food, drink and entertainment, you do generally have a very casualized workforce in kind of working in customer facing roles. And normally quite a few people are kind of generally on like low pay, and there's a lack of career pathways, I think have been kind of discussions that I've had at kind of previous conferences within Australia. And so it was like a really terrible I suppose, a really terrible impact on those employees, but also the businesses that were involved. So I suppose now the kind of shift is trying to kind of support businesses to kind of to get back up and running, but also I suppose kind of how do we attract people back to work in some of these kind of more casualized roles again, and how do we generate kind of better career pathways and think about kind of the nighttime work kind of more holistically and some of the challenges around that. So that's something that I'm particularly interested in learning more about as well.
And I think, Anna, also what he's saying really highlights the fact that it impacted younger people much more profoundly, because they were the ones actually in casualized labor, and they're also the ones that have, in general speaking, thrive at in participation in the nighttime activities, festivals, music, and so forth, theatre, and everything else. So I think it really has shown the burden has been on those segments of our community. So it really is incumbent on us to really see how we can actually re-engage.
And the skills challenge will continue for years to come. One of the biggest barriers to building back the nighttime economy is a lack of labour, particularly within hospitality and the performing arts. Lots of people who were stagehands and roadies and lighting technicians, went into other industries when COVID hit. So that is a real barrier. We've got about 20% vacancy rate in parts of the hospitality sector within Sydney. And again, that will take time. We've had our borders closed for a long time, so international students are only starting to come back. And we are in a bit of a race for talent in terms of skills. It's been a bit of a reckoning for certain industries as well. I think the hospitality and food and beverage industry in particular have had to reflect on the way some bits of the sector treated some of its workforce, and particularly its international workforce, and that being a factor in the difficulty of hiring staff. One of the big aspects that really changed, certainly in Sydney over COVID, was just our attitude to public space and outdoor space. Like a lot of cities, there was a very quick but significant investment in al fresco infrastructure, particularly to allow businesses to trade outdoors. But there was also a reimagining of what we can do with our public space. A lot of people rediscovered local parks and squares. New South Wales appointed what we think is the first ever Minister for public space or public spaces, certainly in Australia. I don't know if there's an international version. So again, we're looking at public spaces almost as a sort of human right for people. It was really sobering to see a lot of people in lockdown when they couldn't move more than a few kilometres from their residence, just did not have access to green space or to water, and that compounded some of the challenges of lockdown. So we're starting to think in terms of designing the city, how do you ensure that people have access to public and open space? But in terms of the nighttime economy, and particularly given the pretty temperate climate that we have in Sydney, how do you activate those areas so you can get people doing al fresco dining, food markets, live performance in the open air?
Yeah, and I think governments have been really innovative during COVID in kind of supporting kind of the development of those, or supporting or facilitating kind of the likes of outdoor dining and that type of thing. And I suppose it's kind of, it can be easier. I suppose when there's nothing to be, there's nothing broken, there's nothing to be fixed, and there's no time of crisis, then it's very difficult, I think, to implement some of these changes, because it's very difficult to kind of say if there isn't a problem, why does government need to do something? Whereas I think kind of the crisis of the pandemic really kind of made or forced governments to kind of have to respond and really think about kind of what to do, and also were able to kind of push things through much quicker than would have been the case in the past. So we just had kind of a huge amount of change, I think, kind of very, very quickly, and a lot of positive change as well, I think, kind of for the future. I suppose at the moment it's really difficult to kind of, I suppose at the moment the challenge will be to kind of keep that momentum going and kind of make sure that it's not a short-term fix, but actually we kind of thinking long-term about kind of what next, I suppose. So what do the public want, and to be able to kind of plan for that future. So it's yeah, I think particularly around things like kind of noise management as well, I think is kind of has been a big challenge, I suppose, as we've got kind of, as we get more noise in our city centres, kind of managing the kind of the balance between kind of residents' needs and then kind of live entertainment in particular's needs and that type of thing. I suppose there'll still be kind of a whole heap of challenges for government to kind of work through with planning for that.
Also with things like regulation, in the early days of the pandemic, the New South Wales government brought in some emergency laws to allow bars and cafes to sell takeaway alcohol, which kept a lot of places alive. But there is new research that sort of demonstrates that takeaway alcohol can have a small but significant impact on domestic violence. So I think with a lot of these things that were brought in for understandable reasons during the pandemic, we are now having to review noise totally. I mean, it's suddenly people were used to having no noise for 6 months when everything was locked down, and then suddenly they realised the sound of the cafe opening up next door and didn't like it. So that is a real challenge for us going forward.
Yeah, I think there's kind of been a lot of interest in Australia in developing kind of special entertainment precincts as well to kind of, I suppose, to overcome some of those challenges. So I'm kind of, for example, the ones that happened up in Queensland with Fortitude Valley, but I know that there's work underway in New South Wales, and WA is looking at it as well. So it's kind of really that I know that it's kind of something that lots of people are looking at. And I suppose it also makes me think about some of the, I suppose the other thing as a result of the pandemic in terms of governance is that kind of that we've got much greater advocacy, I suppose, for those kind of core nighttime economy, food, drink and entertainment businesses through the likes of the Nighttime Industries Association, which I think was started by the 24-hour Economy Commissioner for Sydney. So kind of, but those kind of groups have really kind of taken off, and there's been a lot more kind of networking, I suppose, between councils and within council as well, kind of to try and kind of solve these problems. So I think there's a lot of, I suppose, in terms of kind of keeping that momentum going, there's a lot kind of underway at the moment.
Just the one thing I want to also add in just about the COVID response also, just in regards to the nighttime economy, there's been significant evidence or effort to refashion who participates in the nighttime economy. So you're seeing cities across the world, and particularly also in Sydney, is where they want to make sure that they're inviting all ages and making sure all demographics are participating in those various different public, open and shared spaces that are existing within our CBD anchor hubs around there. So, for example, we are seeing now, museums opening late night in evenings, families and kids are coming in at 7 p.m. to go and see, exhibitions at museums. There's outdoor kind of food festivals that are occurring, and the idea is to refashion the nighttime economy. Art galleries are opening up later, and I think that is the way, of one way I'm seeing it as, of revitalizing those CBDs, is bringing more foot traffic in, bringing more traffic for those local businesses. Obviously, the old kind of formula of the nighttime economy of being about, serving alcohol and also about being people between the ages of 18 and 35, I think is a really archaic way of it. It's now, the Mediterranean culture has it it's from, 8 months to 88 years old. And that's, I think, when you go to cities in Barcelona or elsewhere in the Mediterranean, you see that level of vibrancy that is there, that makes it quite resilient.
No, I think that's really, really interesting and really useful to kind of highlight, I suppose, because yes, it's definitely, I think there's a definite kind of push within Australia and I suppose elsewhere as well to kind of move away from that kind of alcohol centered kind of nightlife to a broader demographic, broader interests and greater diversity. I suppose it just makes me think about something that I'm particularly interested in, which is kind of also looking kind of more holistically at when we look at the 24-hour economy or think about kind of nighttime work, to not just think about, or nighttime economy, but not just to think about the kind of those kind of core, the food, drink and entertainment, but also kind of what else is happening. So as part of my PhD, one of the things I'll be looking at is actually understanding who works at night. And from some of the research that I've looked at, for example, I suppose food, drink and entertainment is a really big part of it. But for example, kind of nursing and healthcare is, there's a huge number of kind of nurses, healthcare workers around at night. But then you've also got the likes of kind of logistics, street cleaning, all the other activity that occurs at night, and kind of supporting those workers throughout their kind of nighttime patterns in the same way as kind of the daytime is supported. I suppose also kind of flexible working as well. So,
and of course, then the questions are posed about equity and access with public transport, for example, at during the nighttime, and also issues in regards to safety, for example, for females. So I think there's a wide range of issues that need to be addressed if we are going to be refashioning the nighttime economy.
May I jump in? Thanks. We have learned that COVID-19 has impacted different sectors, different nighttime activities in a different way. Anna mentioned before that there are some innovative practices of governance raised during COVID-19. I just would like to ask you if you can provide an example of innovation in policies and governance around the nighttime economy during the pandemic.
I can talk about bottled cocktails. Bottled cocktails saved saved a number of businesses, but I think saved a number of relationships as well, because people were stuck at home with nothing else to do. The takeaway alcohol element was really important. I mentioned it earlier. Suddenly, particularly for small bars, they were faced with obviously not being able to open and with very limited income coming in. So there were some really innovative practices from small bars in particular, who put together some really niche offerings, reflecting the fact that people, particularly during lockdown, were stuck at home. They were actually saving quite a lot of money because they weren't spending on transport and going out. So there were some really interesting new products that came on the market around sort of premium takeaway. Essentially, some higher end restaurants would do deliveries that you could cook at home and have that fine dining experience at home. Again, they were really popular because people wanted to treat themselves and to do something that was quite nice in the depths of lockdown. In live performance, we saw some really interesting developments as well. When lockdown ended, a number of the more innovative venues started doing things like 2 shows a night, because to get around capacity restrictions, social distancing restrictions, they would have a sort of early sitting and a later sitting, which not only allowed them to essentially get in the same crowd that they would without restrictions, it allowed them to target different demographics. So a slightly older audience would go to the earlier show, and a younger audience would go to a later show. And I think it really showed that although a lot of sectors across the board really suffered during the pandemic, the more innovative were allowed to certainly to keep their head above water, and in some cases to prosper, and the less innovative, unfortunately, didn't do so well. I think in terms of governance, in terms of regulation, I think to Anna's point, it did lead to a bit of kind of creative destruction and trying different things, which you don't always get in government. Taking over things like road space suddenly became a lot easier than it would have been without the pandemic. Temporary closure of roads for things like al fresco, or to give people more public space, then led to more permanent closures, which I think are certainly making Sydney more livable. I think certainly from a Sydney perspective, there was much more appetite to get rid of regulation if it was prohibitive. So things around 24-hour deliveries, rules were changed around that. So it goes back to the classic line around never waste a crisis. And I think certainly within this policy area, there has been some really innovative policy making over the last couple of years.
I think you provide a fantastic synopsis, but the one I want to highlight in what you've said, James, is definitely the outdoor dining. The outdoor dining has transformed quite a few different local high streets in a way that has been unfathomable beforehand. It also allowed them to actually extend their kind of customer base. It was obviously they had the restrictions in the number of people per square meter, and it just promoted a much more exciting, almost communal social interaction. I think that was fantastic. But one other one that I personally loved was the Opera House had a few virtual performances, and quite a few different places, even like museums, used digital as a way of almost kind of democratizing arts and culture. So if previously you had to kind of commute in almost 60 k's from Penrith to go into the Opera House or into an event at the museum, now you could just dial in, and that wasn't just about distance. It also was for people in various different socioeconomic, different kind of demographics, also people that were differently abled. It really kind of, in a way, kind of leveled and made things much more kind of equitable in access. So I think if there are any of those kind of digital innovations that can be retained, I think it will be a real advantage going forward. But there have been some tremendous positives. Obviously, it's been a traumatic period for many, but it's been also quite a few positives.
Yes, I think definitely being able to attend sessions like this one that normally I might have to kind of travel to Europe, which wouldn't be possible just for one session or for a couple of days necessarily, and yet I'm able to kind of communicate in this way is absolutely fantastic. I think things like the Australian Digital Concert Hall and kind of there were lots of kind of innovations to enable kind of more live streaming of events and that type of thing was absolutely fantastic. I suppose the other thing was, I mean, we shifted definitely, and this is kind of, there's pros and cons to this, I suppose, but we shifted a lot to kind of, there was a lot more kind of meal delivery services, a lot more takeaway and kind of ghost kitchens and that type of thing. And I know, for example, I was looking in India where they're kind of actually kind of supporting further kind of ghost kitchen development and actually providing land specifically for that. So I suppose there's that, but also within dining, also things like use of the contactless table ordering, which I think is kind of probably here to stay in a lot of places, because I think I tried it in the UK maybe about 4 years ago, and it was a bit, I couldn't get my phone to do it properly, whereas I think now everybody's kind of got the hang of those things, and I imagine it kind of makes it a lot easier for kitchens and for wait staff as well. So yeah, I imagine there's kind of a lot of things which will be here to stay.
Thanks,
Anna, can I just ask, in terms of the geography of going out, one thing we've seen in Sydney is that people are got used to going out in the local suburbs during sort of COVID restrictions, and it leads into this challenge around people not going into the CBD and other central areas. Is that the case in Melbourne? Are you seeing sort of people rediscovering their local neighbourhoods?
I suppose I haven't actually looked at any data on this, I suppose, but I know kind of from my own personal experience, definitely we are kind of meeting further or closer to in our local suburbs, I suppose. However, the likes of kind of Melbourne Money, so Melbourne Money, for people who don't know, is a scheme where if you go and spend $40 on food and entertainment in the CBD in Melbourne, then you get 25. You take a photo, upload the receipt, and you get 25% of your cost back, returned to your bank account. I think that has definitely kind of encouraged more people to head into the city. I think we're finding that kind of it's changeable by day of the week. So I think at one point it was people were kind of heading into the city at the weekend. So when we were allowed out of lockdown, we were all very excited about kind of heading to the city. The draw card were those kind of food, drink and entertainment. It wasn't about going back to work. It was about going out, being able to kind of dine out in restaurants again, being able to kind of see the night lights and kind of and go and experience entertainment. And so kind of the weekends were the time when it was busy in the city. I suppose now people are kind of heading more and more, they're kind of heading back into the city. Obviously, kind of we haven't got full offices yet, but people are heading back in. And we have got a kind of, I think it's Monday to Thursday Melbourne money now. So it's to try and encourage people to go in during the week. But we actually find, or from what I've seen, and also from the road traffic, people tend to kind of, so a lot of people are working kind of Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And so then you end up with a quiet Monday and a quiet Friday. And I don't know whether that's kind of a worldwide trend. I haven't looked at the mobility data recently, but yeah, I think it's interesting that there's been kind of shifts, I suppose, by day of the week as to whether people are heading into the city or kind of staying kind of within the suburbs. So, and I think that's where we're still kind of settling in. I think it's still shifting. It hasn't kind of completely leveled off to where it's going to be. And I suppose that'll be kind of happening all over the world. And it'd be interesting to kind of see where we end up, I suppose.
Thanks, everyone. I just would like to ask you one question about strategic planning. What's the value of strategic planning in the governance of the nighttime economy?
I think the Greater Cities Commission might be well placed to address that.
Indeed, I think for us, obviously, it's about making sure we have coordination and collaboration. There are so many different interdependent and interconnected pieces that really make sure the nighttime economy is, a really strong and vibrant kind of economy. But I think from our perspective at the Greater Cities Commission, we're having a diverse spread of local, strategic and metropolitan centres across our 6 centres. And all of our LGAs have identified the visitor economy in their local strategic planning statements as being a critical component of it. And as part of that, they've all mentioned the nighttime economy. So our relationship across the down into our councils as part of our strategic planning process, I think is really critical in serving to how we can coordinate a series of initiatives, or also coordinate our planning for the longer term. So what we do over here is actually plan to kind of build in planning for the longer term, for building Australia's first global city region. And obviously our colleagues down in Melbourne are one of our kind of playful competitors, but the 6 city region is about us positioning Greater Sydney as being realising the global scale for us to compete globally as a globally competitive city. But the nighttime economy is critical as part of that. I think as we were saying earlier on, you need to have a vibrant local economy, nighttime economy to attract the relevant investors. But I think back onto governance, it's just about, it's about coordination, it's about collaboration, because no one party can do it on its own. We need to all come together, and what we do is bring everyone to the party and to the conversation.
Thanks a lot,
Nadia. Yeah, I think also there's kind of I can't remember. I think we actually looked at it at one point last year, but the SEP, which was the planning, some of the planning kind of that was initiated in Sydney, and I'm not sure exactly where it got to, but I think one of the things that was being looked at is kind of change of use of buildings. So for example, if you had a retail space, being able to convert it to into kind of cafes, restaurants, etc. Small produce, I think, just off the top of my head. I'm not sure if I've remembered it exactly correctly. But I suppose being able to shift some of the uses of space as we kind of respond to the pandemic and towards more of those kind of consumption uses. And I suppose, and then kind of, and also with events, I think there was some information in there about kind of supporting or enabling, allowing kind of longer or more frequent events, for example, so which was kind of allowing kind of the noise levels to be a little bit louder for longer perhaps than they were before. And as I mentioned before, kind of, I suppose related to that is that kind of, how do you then respond? How do you then kind of support residents who don't, because I suppose there's a lot of people, when we think about the nighttime economy, there's so many people who actually just use the nighttime to sleep and want to kind of have kind of very domestic lives at night, kind of quiet, peaceful time with their family. And I suppose we kind of need to also respect that. And how do we kind of balance that against kind of activating the city or activating kind of spaces? And how do you I don't think it's such a difficult thing to manage, and kind of is very much dependent on particular localities. But I imagine that's going to be, it's going to be a particular area of discussion over the next kind of 10 years or so, kind of trying to figure out how we kind of look at that differently as we use our cities differently in terms of planning.
And I think, Anna, your comment a moment ago about refashioning existing buildings, that's one of the common piece of feedback we're getting from our partners in local government, is about how can they refashion, repurpose existing assets, and also be it roads, be it open spaces, public spaces, existing buildings, and also making sure it can be used for a longer period. So you're maximizing that kind of economic and social value out of those places and spaces. And they are grappling with these issues on a day-to-day basis with their local regulations. But those challenges of conflicts of, the noise versus the other intentions behind it, the events versus the local areas that previously were much more quiet, now is having events held up over there. I mean, similarly also, if you're closing off a street, for example, in some councils, you need to have a terrorism plan, for example, and so that can be quite a cumbersome approach. And how do you overcome that? And that's one way of reducing the cost of allowing those LGAs to have a bit more local events in the nighttime, and particularly utilizing the existing assets of those local roads or those local parks. So these are quite common challenges, and I think for all of us in state government, James works for the Office of the Nighttime Commissioner. I'm in the Greater Cities Commission, but the reality is where it's being felt on a day-to-day basis is in the city councils, because they're the ones that are actually have to make these approvals that are coming through on a regular basis, and they've been quite adaptive. And it's a mixed bag, but they are being quite adaptive to it. So the burden, unfortunately, is with them, but I think state government is picking up, and that's where the creation of the Office of the Nighttime Commissioner was formed, and also ourselves is also looking to see how we can be innovative.
And I would say having a plan is absolutely integral to getting things done. The fact that you can have I think I mentioned earlier, we're the only state or territory government in Australia to have a 24-hour economy strategy. There aren't that many governments around the world that have got a comprehensive 24-hour economy or nighttime economy strategy. It gives you the ability to walk into other bits of government and get them to deliver things, because it's been agreed on behalf of government as a whole. Without it, it's incredibly difficult to do. Collaboration is incredibly important. Soft power is incredibly important. You have to build relationships with different parts of government. We can't deliver what we want to do without having good relationships with 10 or 12 other different agencies and departments within government, and we need to maintain those good relationships. But without that driving plan, proposal, direction of travel, it's incredibly difficult to get things done. And that was part of the problem that Sydney found itself in a few years ago. There was no coordinating force within government to try and achieve real progress and results. So that's what we're trying to do. But our plan has to be constantly evolving. There's no point just, our strategy was developed 18 months ago. Sorry, it was published 18 months ago. It was developed 2 years ago. So so much has changed since then. We've got to be constantly evolving and pivoting our strategy to make sure it's relevant to what's obviously been a period of incredible change.
Thanks, everyone. As we are going close to the panel, I would like to pose you the last question, which is, how can we advance the research on the nighttime economy to support practice around it? What are your thoughts on this?
Obviously. Sorry, you go, Anna.
It's okay. It's all good.
I was just going to say, obviously, fund universities more in the first instance. It's just, so I'm not an academic. Some of my best friends are, but I find it interesting, though, from a non-academic perspective, just how sparse the data can be around nighttime economy, 24-hour economy globally. I struggle to find really rich data, certainly from Australian perspective. So I don't know whether that's industry not coming to the table, or it's just not given enough prominence within universities. But I think linking it to some of those broader social and economic issues is really important. Totally agree with Anna's point around employment. For so long, the nighttime economy, 24-hour economy, was just associated with people going out, with socializing, with hospitality. So much more than that, in terms of healthcare, logistics, security, a whole range of professional services and lots of different sectors. So I guess perhaps linking it more to the to economic outcomes might be a way to go. But other than that, we're funding bits of research, so maybe getting other bits of government to do that is a place to start.
Yes, I definitely agree on data-wise. I've been looking for everything I possibly can, as I think spend opening hours and GPS data is really exciting, but I would love to see the Australian Bureau of Statistics do some provide some mass surveys that actually understand what people want from their night times across Australia, and to be able to interrogate some of that data and understand what's actually going on and what people really want. I will be using time use surveys as part through my PhD to actually understand what's happening. So I think I'm quite excited about looking at that data, because I've been able to access the micro data, which I couldn't have been able to do as a consultant. So I'm really looking forward to doing that. I think also, I suppose is quite a good time to plug. So my supervisor, Professor Michele Acuto, who couldn't be here tonight, but he and Professor Alison Young at the Melbourne Centre for Cities have been awarded an ARC, Australian Research Council grant to research nighttime economy. It's called a night shift. So looking more at people who work at night, and as part of that, there's going to be a whole heap of opportunities for councils and governments to work with academia to be able to understand the night better. I can perhaps put a link to it in the chat. And there's also a couple of PhD scholarships that will be available through that. So I think things like that will be really exciting. And I think just opportunities like this for people to come together, so academics and practitioners to come together and talk about some of these issues and the nights, and to create some of these relationships, I suppose, and develop our relationships and learn from one another, I suppose, is just so important to being able to develop our knowledge in this space.
I think, Anna, well put. I think it's these forums are really so important, but also I do think, James, in your view on data sharing is critical. We found when we were doing the COVID report was the lack of data and the lack of consistent data, or quite a few data gaps. And the reality was, the more we brought people together from other areas in government, and we were able to fill those gaps. So I think by taking a collaborative approach or a partnership approach, we can fill as many of those gaps in together on the data space. And so I think that is a particular challenge for the nighttime economy, is understanding the data around it. One that I've got to go and laugh on about, because I have been having a few cheeky smiles while we're having this, was as part of the nighttime economy, I'm in the office, almost alone in the office, and every so often the cleaner wants to go and do her nighttime, her job, and wants to go and vacuum. And so I'm occasionally singing, so no, not yet, not yet. And so I'm laughing because that is the reality of the nighttime economy. You know, this office is where I'm employed, but also other people are employed in the nighttime, you know, and they are eager to go and vacuum and wipe down the desk, because obviously we have a COVID safe policy. And then every so often I'm putting my camera off so I can wave the lights on, because obviously we kind of saving on electricity by making sure we're on a different kind of lighting spectrum. But it's I think it's, you know, when we see the nighttime economy, we've got to appreciate there are people that live in the shadows that do work in the nighttime, and they also need to make sure that there's safety for those people that are working at nighttime. And so I'll give one last plug for what the Greater Cities Commission is doing. We do have a women's safety charter that is really kind of critical in what we think in taking the nighttime economy and unfolding it in a way that makes it a much more accessible economy and sector. And there's some great things that have been happening overseas for women's safety, and hopefully can happen over here in Sydney. Also, there's the Purple Flag, which is in the UK, which is a great initiative, and also across Australia and the UK of Ask for Angela, which is a great initiative of where if you're feeling unsafe in a venue, you are able to go and ask for Angela at the bar. So I think as part of the challenge for us is about how can we shift the dial and make those people that do work in the nighttime economy to make our nighttime experience so enjoyable, like mine will be this evening, to make sure that they are safe and they're also valued, and they can also go back and return home to their families in a safe way.
Thanks everyone for bringing your experience and research today in this panel. It was very interesting to engage with different perspectives and expertise. And the main question of the panel was if there is, and what about a thriving narrative around nighttime economy in Australian cities? I don't think we can get an answer. We'll leave this question open, but if I can summarize the key points of this panel before opening up the discussion with some questions from our audience. We have seen that COVID-19 has impacted the behaviors of people and our communities. Australian cities have seen a rescaling in governance around the nighttime economy. As you mentioned, the city centers have been highly impacting, and there is a need of night activities in our suburbs, in our neighborhoods, and this brings new questions around the governance of the nighttime economy. What do we have to govern? Do we have to govern city centers? Do we have to govern neighborhoods, regions, and so on and so forth? We have also seen that there has been innovative practices around nighttime economy, resilience, and adaptation to COVID-19 pandemic. And there is a need of coordinations in different levels of governance and different type of stakeholders around how to govern the nighttime economy. So thanks everyone. Thanks Naeem, Anna, and James for participating in this exciting conversation.